He wasn't sure how he'd ended up in this section of the city, far from the towers of glass and steel. Somehow his feet led him to this ancient quarter where asphalt and concrete gave way to cobblestones. It was strangely appropriate, his own thoughts hearkening back to the twisted path that had brought him here, and he found some small measure of comfort in the old stone structures. Darkness had fallen as he'd wandered the burrow, and he pulled his coat tighter around him as the cold mist crept into his bones. Turning a corner, he spotted an old wooden pub sign hanging above a door, an almost lurid depiction of a gleeful demon clutching a parchment. The devil's bargain. Something about the image made him smile, and the soft yellow light streaming through the window seemed to beckon to him. Suddenly, a glass and a warm fire sounded heavenly, and a soft jingle of bells announced his entrance as he opened the door and stepped inside. The tavern was as dated as the street outside, with thick beams separated by faded plaster. It was cozy and inviting, an intimate establishment that sported an almost black-polished bar, the wooden plank forming it as heavy as something stripped from an ancient galleon. Perhaps it was, the man mused, seating himself upon one of the high-backed stools, just as dark-haired woman stepped out from what appeared to be the kitchen entrance. "Well, hello there," she smiled, her accent pleasing, but difficult to place. She was dressed conservatively, in a black and gray frock that fit perfectly with the decor. "What can I get you?" "I don't know," he admitted. "I was just passing by, and I saw your sign." He shrugged, considering the question as he looked at the collection of bottles lined up against the far wall. "Perhaps you could suggest something?" Her brow twitched in curiosity, and he saw her eyes were even darker than her hair. "As it happens, I take my profession very seriously," she remarked, stepped forward to give him a learned once-over. "A man's glass should fit like a well-tailored suit," she explained, reaching under the bar and pulling out a bottle of caramel-colored liquid before removing a snifter from the overhead rack and pouring a splash. "And you, my friend, have the look of someone who's carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders," she said, sliding the drink to him. "You have no idea," he sighed, before lifting the snifter with his palm and letting it swirl, inhaling the aromas. He blinked in surprise as he caught a whiff, tilting it back and letting the liquid fire dance on his tongue. Warmth seemed to radiate throughout his body as he savored its taste, before sighing in contentment as he leaned back. "Gascony Armagnac," he smiled. "Now that takes me back. It's been years, not since." His voice trailed off into silence, as a wry expression and a slight shake of his head forestalled any questions. "I must say, well done," he told his host. Her eyes twinkled in delight. "Something told me you were a man with a refined palate," she chuckled, as she topped off his glass. "I keep this bottle for special customers." "And how do you know I'm special?" he asked, taking another sip. "Call it bartender's intuition," she grinned. "Besides, it's a slow night. I'm glad for the distraction." The man looked around the empty tavern. "I'm surprised, given the chill outside. I'd have thought you'd be packed." He savored the warm, dark sensations of the cognac before cocking his head. "Aged 20 years?" he guessed. 40, she smirked. He gave out a low whistle. "How did you know I could afford it?" The bartender chuckled. "I tell you what, it being just the two of us, I'll make you a deal." He raised his own eyebrow at that. "Like the sign outside?" She threw back her head and laughed. "Nothing quite that formidable, I promise." "No, I had something else in mind." She pulled another snifter from the rack and poured, before coming around the bar to take the seat beside him, perching herself on the stool as she crossed her legs. "Tell me a story," she smiled. "If it's one I haven't heard before, drinks are on the house." The man sighed and reached for his wallet. "Maybe I should just go," he said wearily. The bartender placed a hand on his arm. "Why?" she asked. "You can't tell me it's that you have no stories to tell," she continued, "because I can see them in your eyes, just begging to be let out." "No, you're right about that," he admitted. "Stories I have in abundance, you might say. The problem is that you wouldn't believe any of them." "Try me," she smirked. "And when you accuse me of making them up, or worse, of being utterly mad." He pressed her. Her smile only grew wider as she took up her own glass and sipped. "You tend bar long enough, you develop a sixth sense about these things," she informed him. Liars and madmen I can spot a mile off. And you don't strike me as either. I have been, he said quietly, when I needed to be. We all have parts to play, my friend, she replied, taking another sip. This time he was the one to bark out a laugh. You have no idea, he said once again, chuckling ruefully. He tilted back his glass, letting the dark liquor slide down his throat, working its magic. I'm not even sure where to begin, he said at last. I've always found the beginning to be a good place, she chuckled, as she refilled his glass. The beginning, he repeated, staring into his glass. Well, in that case, it all started with a board meeting. Oh dear, this is going to be even more dreadful than I'd thought, isn't it? The man gazed out the window, his thoughts a million miles away. You could say that. In conclusion, based on our current projections, we anticipate species 47719 will come to dominate 3 of the 5 spiral arms within the next galactic milli-rotation, Stiabermanocum explained. Their birth rates, adaptability, and willingness to embrace a certain carnivorous single-mindedness, he said after a moment's thought, are unrivaled by any of the other species in their path. Once they develop the ability to travel beyond their own stellar system, they'll be virtually unstoppable. He gazed around the room. Are there any questions? I have a question, Cimarellet Marathon replied, rising to his feet. Just what is it we're proposing to do about this situation? Do? Stiaberman asked in surprise. Why not nothing, of course. This body has always maintained a strict hands-off policy regarding other species. They develop or fail based on their own strengths and weaknesses. Intervention on our part would be catastrophic. Why? It could throw entire sectors into disarray. And what will happen when species 47719 starts eating their way through the galaxy? Marathon demanded. Won't that cause massive disruptions as well? Of course, the speaker said in placating tones. But that is the natural order. Interference with the system on that grandest scale is simply unthinkable, he said gently. Why? Cimarellet asked simply. Who are we to decide the fates of the various races? Stiaberman answered, as a hint of ire crept into his voice. We have no right to make those kinds of decisions. But that's exactly what we are doing, Marathon fired back. By allowing species 47719 to wipe out any other life form that gets in their way, we're deciding their fates. He pulled up his notes, taking a moment before locating the reference. Species 13004, he said at last. Our own survey reports show they're highly skilled artists, philosophers, scientists. They show promise in a number of intellectual pursuits. Just imagine for a moment the discoveries they might one day pioneer, if given the chance. He looked up from his notes. Only they won't get that chance, since they're slated to fall to the clutches of 47,719. With their low birth rate and pacifistic tendencies, they're doomed. So you're an alien, the bartender said carefully. I told you you wouldn't believe me, he sighed. Well, I haven't said that yet, now have I? She smiled. He blinked. So you're saying you do believe me? She reached for the bottle, topping off their glasses. I haven't said that either. Then I'm afraid I'm confused, he said at last. Let's just say, the jury is still deliberating, she smirked. He regarded her for a moment, before finding a smile of his own. Well, if nothing else, at least I'll get a few free drinks out of this, he chuckled. Oh, and you're so sure of that, now are you? She said haughtily. You think you're the first person to walk through that door claiming to be from the stars. The first sane one, I'm willing to bet. A sly grin appeared on her face. I'd be careful of making those kinds of bets in the devil's bargain, she chortled. Bound to be all sorts of consequences. He suddenly froze, peering closer at her. Who are you? He whispered. Her smile rivaled the Cheshire Cat's. I'm the one pouring the drinks, she said with a wink. That's not what I asked, he said, shaking his head. Like I said, we all have our parts to play, she said enigmatically, picking up her glass. Now, where were we? He shrugged, surrendering to the inevitable. All right, but I'm letting you know now. It's a long story. I like long stories, she grinned. Please, continue. He took another sip of his cognac. Well, Stiaberman had a few choice words for me, after the meeting. I don't know what is brought on this outburst of yours, but it ends here. Styaberman Occam growled. Once the rest of the committee departed, one or two shared looks of sympathy, but none were willing to lay their profession on the line, as he apparently just had. Sir, think about what you're saying, Semirellet Marathon pleaded with him. Thousands of intelligent species are at risk, and to just cast them aside. We do not interfere. The speaker thundered. That is the way it has been since the beginning, the way it must be. Are we to suddenly play adjudicator every time two races come into conflict? He jabbed a pointed claw into Marathon's chest. Are you suggesting that we play God? He suddenly realized why Occam was digging in his heels. No, of course not, he stammered. Taking on that kind of role would be a disaster. But species 47719 is a special case, one that goes far beyond our normal parameters. Surely you can see that. We make one exception, and where does it stop? Styaberman demanded. Who decides which race deserves special consideration? By what criteria? He glowered at the younger committee member. What makes you think we possess the wisdom to make those kinds of decisions? With only a limited understanding of the possible consequences, your proposed cure could be infinitely worse than the disease. But sir, get out, the speaker hissed. I had such hopes for you once, but now I see that you never belonged here. He gathered up his notes, looking at the forlorn administrator with contempt. I suggest you collect your belongings, Marathon, for your services are no longer required. Styaberman turned his back on him, departing the chamber without another word. Semirellet looked around at the meager furnishings of his office. He'd always meant to give the space more personality, but something more important always seemed to come up. With a heavy sigh, he opened the case and began removing the various mementos he'd collected over the years from the shelves, storing them away. A polite tap on the door startled him, spinning him about. Lilthrazer Pashna hovered at the entrance, a fragile smile gracing her features. May I come in? She asked. Certainly. He mumbled, his shoulders sagging in defeat. So you're the one they sent to deliver the news, he said quietly. I suppose I should be grateful it's coming from a friend. It's not as bad as all that, she replied, entering the office, but it's not great either. I'm being dismissed, he said with a shrug. What else is there to say? Not exactly, she said after a moment. Marathon stared at her in confusion. I don't understand, he said at last. The speaker wanted to dismiss you from the service, but I managed to talk him out of it. I pointed out your skills, your training, your years of service. He didn't want to listen at first, but he finally came around. He brightened at the news, but what she said next dashed his hopes. That being said, you can't remain here on the committee, she continued. Styaberman wants you gone, so you're being reassigned. He's sending you back into the field. Field work, he said woodenly. It was more than just a demotion. It was a slap in the face. I suppose I should be grateful, he said at last. You should, she replied, the inflection in her voice sharp enough to cut through his despair. I know how this might appear at first glance, but there are still possibilities. I know. He managed to get out. I guess I'm feeling a little sorry for myself. Thank you for all you've done. Semirellet gave her a wan smile as struggled to put on a brave face. So where is he sending me? System TK 447, 189, LM 958. She replied. You're to oversee the development of species 75106. He frowned, not recognizing the system or the species. Pulling up the information on his workstation, Marathon was unable to stifle a groan. Not only are they slated to be one of the earlier entrees on species 47,719's menu, they've only just stumbled onto the very basics of metallurgy, he said unhappily. No wonder Styaberman is sending me there. The speaker didn't choose the system. I did, Lilthrazer said. You? Semirellet said in shock. But why? She stepped closer, speaking in urgent tones. Do you think you're the only one who fears what species 47719 will do? She said conspiratorially. There are many of us that feel the same, but our hands are tied. We're fighting rotations of tradition here, and for the most part those same edicts have served us well. She sighed and shook her head. But what the speaker doesn't understand is that sometimes you must break the rules in order to serve the greater good. He looked at her curiously. I suppose it's nice to know I'm not alone, he said at last, but I don't see how this changes anything. Lilthrazer placed a hand on his shoulder. Go to TK 447, 189, LM 958, she urged. Do what you do best. Investigate. Study species 75106. Maybe something will come to you. Like what? He asked in frustration, but she was already leaving, heading for the door. She paused for a moment, glancing over her shoulder. Thought there are always options, she said enigmatically as she left, leaving him even more confused than ever. From orbit, it was a beautiful world. On the ground, however, the attraction soon disappeared. Oh, the planet itself had its aesthetics, no doubt, but species 75106 was another story entirely. Semirellet had undergone the standard gene replacement and nano-enhancements before departing, and now had the outward appearance of a native. It was an uncomfortable process to say the least, especially given how radically different his bodily dimensions were now. Just the extra digit at the end of each limb alone was giving him trouble. Still, it could be worse. One of his assignments early in his career had been with an aquatic species. Even now he still had the occasional nightmare where he was drowning, and the flippers. He'd landed on the planet's largest continent, sending out his remotes to record the languages. Already he'd picked up the basics, though it was little more than a pigeon at this point. But it had been enough to bring him here, to this rocky outcropping overlooking a narrow valley. As Semirellet watched a small tribe, little more than an extended family, made their way beside the streambed, completely unaware what was lying in wait for them. Up ahead, a gang of bandits had prepared an ambush, eager to take what few possessions the family carried, though it was the female members of the tribe he suspected to be the real prize. It was his first chance to see the natives in action, under hostile conditions, and he was curious to see how they would react. He held out little hope for the family unit, however, as the trap was well laid. The head brigand tensed, preparing his attack, and still the family came on, oblivious to what fate held in store. Entering the kill zone at last, the leader screamed, leaping out from behind cover and swinging a club while his comrades followed a split second behind. It would be brutal, and he felt pity for the defenseless members of the tribe. That sense of pity quickly turned to disbelief, as the tribe threw off their cloaks and counterattacked, wielding vicious-looking blade weapons, hacking and slicing and stabbing the would-be raiders in a frenzy. The bandits realized their mistake too late, scrambling to escape, but the tribe pursued them with deadly precision. Within minutes it was over, as the tribe's children calmly dispatched the wounded with a slash across the throat, while the adults stripped the bodies of anything useful. So great was their surprise, only a handful of the tribe had been wounded, none seriously, and sooner than he'd thought possible, they were on the move once again, leaving the carrion of their attackers behind for the scavengers. Semirellet watched it play out with a growing sense of awe. That ambush had been well placed, and yet the tribe had utterly annihilated them. How? Had they been alerted? Somehow? Were they always prepared for this? Did it matter? He was rocked back on his heels with sudden realization. There are always options, she'd said. As the carrion eaters sniffed around, a brand new one began to unfold within his mind. It was a plan of desperation, as most plans were, but he had time. Generations of species 75106 lifespan to work with. They were raw and brutal and ignorant, and yet. You have no idea the mission your race just signed on for, he thought with a calculating smile, but you will. All you need is the proper encouragement. Semirellet Marathon rose from his hiding place and began making his way back to his hidden lair, his mind now filled with possibilities. Fascinating, the bartender smiled, topping off their drinks, but one thing puzzles me. Only one? He chuckled. She smiled along with him. This, species 75106. What were they like? The man pointed at the large mirror overhanging the bar. Funny you should ask.